Hello there, U.S. history students. Mr. Deegan here with another edition of VidNotes videos. Today we're going to be talking about the story of Jamestown. So make sure you have your VidNotes packet, Unit 1, and please turn to page 4 and page 5. We're going to be taking notes starting on page 4 today. And our guiding question for today, why did the English settle Jamestown, Virginia? So you're going to be seeing a guest lecture from study.com that's going to dig a little deeper into Jamestown and how it was settled. Enjoy.
On May 14th, 1607, 104 English men and boys set foot on North American soil. They named their settlement Jamestown in honor of the English king, James I, and got started doing what they had come to do: get rich quick by finding the gold they'd all heard stories about. Jamestown had been funded by the Virginia Company, which was a joint stock company, a new kind of public-private partnership investing in New World colonies. The earlier voyages had been paid for by rich businessmen or kings and queens, but joint stock companies combined resources of both. Investors pooled their money to pay all the upfront expenses of starting a colony. And the government gave the company a charter with boundaries and a time limit, and in return was granted a share of stock in the company. The settlers' job was to send raw materials back to England, which the company would then sell for a profit. But many of the colonists were also hoping to strike it rich. The fact that most of them were only men shows that the settlers didn't intend to stay very long. Jamestown had trouble from the start. The settlers had chosen a location with defense in mind. They were far enough up the river to avoid the Spanish Navy that patrolled the coast. And they were on a peninsula with a deep water port, and there weren't any Indians. But what was good for the defense was bad for their health. The tide carried in seawater that they just couldn't drink, and the peninsula was a swamp filled with mosquitoes that had malaria. And many of the colonists got dysentery and typhoid because they contaminated the rivers with their own body waste. But it gets worse. Within 2 weeks of their arrival, the Jamestown settlement was under attack by Virginia Indians that were part of the Powhatan Confederacy. By his own account, which a lot of historians don't believe, Governor John Smith was kidnapped and about to be executed when a chief's 12-year-old daughter saved his life. Now, even if the story isn't true, the colonists abandoned everything else they were doing and built a triangular-shaped fort. For years, the colonists fought with local tribes, suffering and inflicting, of course, murders, kidnapping, fires, thefts, and more. This still isn't the end of their problems. Though Governor Smith had imposed a new labor law, if you don't work, you don't eat, most of the colonists were gentlemen and manservants, or they were skilled craftsmen. Not many of them were accustomed to the kind of labor needed to tame a wilderness, and none of them were farmers. Now, even though a few people attempted to grow some crops that summer when they arrived, they were totally unsuccessful because there was an unusual drought that year. So within 8 months, only 35 of the original 104 colonists were still alive. And even though 2 relief ships were sent, they didn't bring enough supplies for the people that were already there, let alone 140 new settlers that came on the boats. And then, the next winter, 1608, a fire destroyed a lot of the supplies they still had remaining. A lot of the Native Americans were hostile, but not all of them. Pocahontas, the Indian girl who supposedly saved John Smith's life, brought food to the starving colonists and intervened on their behalf several times. She was the daughter of a tribal chief named Powhatan. Powhatan offered Jamestown some protection from their hostile neighbors and gave them some food and trade, but he also reminded them that he was in charge by attacking them sometimes. And 2 years later, when Governor John Smith returned to England for medical treatment, Powhatan lost interest in getting along with Jamestown. A third relief mission failed because a hurricane drove the main supply ship aground on the uninhabited island of Bermuda. Now, this disaster actually ended up being Jamestown's salvation a few years later, but we'll discuss that in a minute. Meanwhile, 80% of the settlers who came to Jamestown were dead by the winter of 1609. The desperate survivors of this starving time decided to abandon the colony. They were actually sailing up the James River when they were met by a ship carrying their new governor, and they were forced to turn back and keep trying. It was expensive to keep resupplying the colonists, but the shareholders would have lost everything if the settlement had been abandoned, so they kept sending more colonists. Between 1607 and 1622, the Virginia Company sent 10,000 people to Jamestown, of whom only 2,000 survived. Let's go back to the supply ship that ran aground in Bermuda. All of the people on board survived, and they took apart their old ship and built 2 smaller boats and sailed for Jamestown. At first, their arrival just strained the resources in the colony even further. But this was the turning point in Jamestown. One of the Bermuda survivors, a man named John Rolfe, brought with him seeds for a type of sweet Spanish tobacco. Now, how he got them is unclear, because those seeds were guarded to the death by the Spanish Empire. But Virginia's climate was perfect for growing tobacco. A year later, when Rolfe exported his first crop to England, he became a wealthy man. Sweet Spanish tobacco was in great demand on the London market, and within a few years, Jamestown was booming off this so-called brown gold. In 1614, John Rolfe also improved the colony's chances of survival by marrying Pocahontas. Tobacco is a very labor-intensive crop to grow, and as you've heard, most of the people who went to Jamestown would die, so there was a huge labor shortage. The London Company solved this problem for a little while with a brilliant solution called a headright. An investor could sponsor a worker to go, and in return would get 50 acres of land. Now, the poor workers who got sponsorships were called indentured servants. They agreed to work for a specific amount of time, often 7 years, in exchange for passage to Jamestown, room and board, and a piece of land when their service was complete. The first Africans in Jamestown were indentured servants. This labor system helped Jamestown meet its demand for labor despite the staggering death rate. In 1619, representatives met to set a minimum price for tobacco exports. This assembly grew into the Virginia House of Burgesses, which was the first elected government in America. 3 years later, on March 22nd, 1622, an attack by Powhatan Indians killed a quarter of the population, and that, together with the London Company's insolvency, led King James to revoke the company's charter and declare Jamestown to now be the Royal Colony of Virginia.
You are nearly done, students. What you have left are 3 summary questions on the bottom of page 5. Please answer those now. And when you're done with them, you are done with this lesson. I will see you again for lesson 3. Until then, this is Mr. Deegan signing off.